Okay, I think it's about time to get started, and let me welcome you. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Cliff Lynch. I'm the director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and you have joined us for one of the project briefing sessions that's part of the final week of the Spring 2020 CNI virtual meeting. We'll hear three speakers today, and I'll introduce the topic in just a moment. And when they're done, we will take some questions. I would just note that there is a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to enter questions at any point. We'll respond to them all at the end, but certainly there's no need to wait till the end to put your questions in. I also would note there is a chat window over on the side, and we will be putting out a couple of URLs during the presentation that may be helpful for some of you. Finally, I'll just say that Diane Goldenberg-Hart from CNI will be moderating the Q&A when we get to the end of the presentation. Now, just a quick word about the presentation, which I'm going to be very interested to listen to, and I think you are too. One of the great sort of disagreements among CNI member institutions, and we've explored some aspects of this in executive roundtables in recent years, has been what's the right role of the cloud? Do you go all cloud? Do you do a balance between local and cloud? What's best situated where? What are the pros and cons? And this has been a really lively thematic discussion. We're going to hear here, I think, from one of the institutions that has been more aggressive than many in taking a cloud-first strategy. And I think that we all can learn from their experiences here. So I'm really grateful for, really grateful to Gene Phillips, Favenzio Calvo, and Louis Brooks for sharing that experience and that thinking with us. And I think this is going to be a very timely presentation as well, because I think that in the aftermath of what's happened over the past few months and the pandemic, we are going to see some institutions reassessing how aggressively they want to be moving services into the cloud and shifting off some of the operational and facilities risk to vendors. So with that, it just remains for me to thank our presenters and thank you for joining us, and say over to you, Jean.
All right, thank you, Cliff. So I am Gene Phillips, and we are here to share our experience and moving to AWS, 3 years in the cloud. And so I want to introduce, next slide. So I'm the Associate Dean for Technology and Digital Scholarship at Florida State University Libraries. Louis Brooks is the head of systems and many other things. Favenzio Calvo is the Director of Software Development. Next. So in the beginning is when I came to FSU Libraries in 2013. Okay, our computer room does not look like that, but I think you get the idea. We had an environment where we had the computer room in the libraries, and we started using virtual machines for our critical servers that the campus supports. This is a very expensive solution for us, especially as we needed more and more storage. This solution also had some problems with reliability and a lack of a failover option. Our computer room itself was not optimal. We had AC problems, we had power problems. It was an office that was turned into a computer room. And we had a growing number of services we wanted to offer. We had just recently added programmers to staff, and we were able to add sysadmins. So we had some capabilities in staffing, and now we wanted to offer more services. One of the biggest areas that we saw that we needed to expand into is digital libraries and preservation. Next. So that was our atmosphere that we were working in. This is our traditional setup of servers. Our two critical services were our Easy Proxy server for off-campus access to e-resources, no surprise there, even more important today, and our web service. We see the web server as the front door to our virtual library services, as many, and in addition, many other things. And next. Okay, so what we did was we started looking at the cloud, and I have to say that our first sub-bullet point, storage cost, is probably the thing that inspired us the most. We decided that there were many advantages to the cloud, but this 2 cents a gig versus $4 a gig a month for the campus IT, you couldn't beat that. The campus IT could not compete. They also didn't have very flexible pricing. They had it was $4 a gig no matter what. We looked at it and decided it would cut our costs of 50% for the campus hosting service. In addition, we'd have more reliability. We wouldn't be working with hardware or networking problems. We would be able to have our servers and our data in multiple data centers with no extra charge. It would have doubled our cost to do it in the campus IT virtual machines area. We'd have better monitoring of the services in the cloud. And of course, we wouldn't be dealing with power or climate issues. We also had never really been able to consider disaster recovery or automatic failover really for continuity of operations because of the cost, and it wasn't offered by our campus. And so now the cloud had these abilities. We were able to spin up servers pretty darn quickly. Our servers are not housed in Tallahassee, which every once in a while there is a local disaster such as a hurricane as we start the hurricane season watch right now. And it was inexpensive to mirror servers. So those were the things that we saw as the advantages of moving to the cloud. Next. Oh, there's my dogs. Not my dogs. The one on the left is Lewis's and the one on the right is mine, but that's just a little break and a place that tells me to hand this over to Lewis to talk about how we moved into the cloud.
Thanks, Gene. So after a lot of discussion internally, some testing, going back and forth between our developers and our sysadmins and management, we decided to dip our toe into the cloud. You can go ahead and move to the next slide. Very basic, what I'd call a 0.1 architecture, cloud-based. It's recreating a virtual, recreating a physical server in a virtual environment where you have within one system, you have your CPU, your file storage, your RAM, networking, software, everything is in a server. This is really easy to set up. We did a lot of testing with their free tier of service that AWS and many other cloud vendors provide. And we using this model, we moved up all of our servers, critical mission servers, up into the cloud. And in fact, our Easy Proxy server still uses this architecture, even though we have transitioned all of our other servers to more of a cloud-centric setup. So next slide. One thing I do want to talk about real quick is cloud security, because this is, they use what's called a shared security model in the cloud. AWS itself is compliant with a bunch of different programs, FERPA and HIPAA being the two that we deal the most with for student and for medical data, since we have a medical school on campus. They guarantee that the layer that's below the applications, which includes the compute, the storage, database, networking, virtual hardware, all of that stuff is secure. They're responsible for that. Whereas the customer, that's you, is responsible for the applications that you run, your identity and access management, any kind of server-side encryption, excuse me. So it's a partnership, but there is built-in security into the cloud, so you no longer have to worry about the lower layers of what you're building on. You can just focus on your applications and your data. Next slide. So this is our 1.0 architecture. I call it 1.0 because as opposed to basic moving a physical server into the cloud, we did start taking advantage of their relational database service, which is a database service AWS offers that emulates a lot of different popular databases, MySQL, Oracle, MariaDB, and allows you to connect with those with your existing scripts that are set up for specific databases, but it obfuscates the entire database back in, so you don't have to worry about it or do anything with it. But we had, our primary web server, and then we had, in another availability zone, we had a secondary web server. We also had a primary search server and then a secondary search server. These were all backed up and connected with scripts, mirrored nightly. We tried to do it with Easy Proxy. If you've ever worked with Easy Proxy, it's not the most flexible software. I'll give it its dues in the fact that it's rock solid for what it does, but it's pretty dated, and we had a lot of trouble getting it to adapt to the virtual environment. So like I said, we're still running a very basic architecture with Easy Proxy. Next. So once we get your servers up into the cloud, the next thing that you tend to move into is moving into data in the cloud, which is what we did. We started up backing up servers. Those that were in the cloud made sense, and then our physical servers, so we'd have them all backed up in one location off campus. Then a few years ago, there was the ransomware encryption scams that were going around. So we made a decision. Sorry, my dog's backing in the background. We're having a thunderstorm. File backups, we moved 14 terabytes in a week up to the cloud to protect us from this encryption scam. And we've had it up there ever since. It's been slowly growing. Reason why we have 14 terabytes is because, as you know, librarians never throw anything away. So then we just moved to staff desktops. We just started moving into preservation. I say that with a capital P because that's librarian preservation, not IT preservation, which basically means it needs to be there forever. And we're looking at research data now. We also spun up a bunch of new services because it's easy to do new servers, such as we became a DPLA hub. We set up a Wikimedia Wiki server, which has been hugely successful with our internal communications and sharing knowledge within the library. And our request tracker, or RT ticketing system, which was originally developed to be an IT ticket system, but has been expanded organization-wide. It's now used by special collections, human resources, facilities, a bunch of different groups. Next. So this is where things started to get complicated because it's so easy to set up servers. Back in 2017, we thought we had everything set up. We had our primaries and our backups, but they were all in they were all in North Virginia, and North Virginia went off the grid for AWS. It was in all the newspapers. So then we decided, well, we should have a separate disaster recovery site. And what we did was we mirrored everything we had in North Virginia and Oregon, which got very complicated because we had scripts not only backing up from the primaries to the mirrors, but also from the production site to the disaster recovery site. And you'll see that I say this is a hot site because all of the servers were up and running all the time. We had 3 years commitments for everything. It's very bulletproof. Again, we still didn't have the capability of actually failing over automatically from one system to the other. But I will say that we had 2 hurricanes come through in 1 year. And while the campus's web servers all went down, ours all stayed up. So I was pretty happy with that. Next slide. And then things really got crazy because we had not only our primary and our backup, we also had servers set up in California and Ohio and Canada, which were used for testing or for experimenting by our sysadmins and our developers. We had a lot of new systems, as I mentioned, but we'd also gained a lot of knowledge. This was, 2 years into production, 3 years into working with AWS, because we spent about a year spinning up, getting people ready to work in the cloud. And we had a lot of new knowledge and a lot of new experience. We better understood how things were starting to work in the cloud. And we decided that we really needed to simplify and work on a new plan. And I'll turn it over to Favenzio now, who will talk about our 2.0 architecture.
Okay, thank you, Louis. Yes, so as Louis said, we had been working in the cloud now for a few years, and we realized that we had a few gains. We were doing better as far as money was concerned. We were providing better services, but it was certainly getting unwieldy, and we realized that there was much that we could do to improve, right? And so, the 3-year anniversary was coming up. And this was important because I don't know if you caught this in a previous slide, but the way we were doing our budgeting, it was a 3-year cycle. So we were buying our servers for 3 years. And as the new budget cycle came up, we kind of thought, well, we wanted to reassess what we were doing and think could we do this better, right? So we wanted to optimize for the cloud. And so what does that mean, right? Well, when you want to optimize for the cloud, I think you have to basically shift your thinking into a whole new way, right? And that happens gradually. I think Louis had mentioned how we had already started to use RDS and all these different things. But I think what happens initially is that you're still thinking in the old way of, we have a server here and we want to move it over there, and you're still thinking in the old, hardware way of thinking. At least that was the case for us. But with the 3-year budget cycle coming up, and also something that happened was that we had a denial of service attack that brought down the web server for a few hours. We realized that it was still a little bit more fragile than we wanted it to be, and there was things that we needed to think about. So what does it mean to the cloud is not just servers? I think the cloud is really about the platform, right? And it's about using AWS and all the tools that it gives you. So what we had to do is stop thinking about the servers and stop thinking about services. And this is what happens when you start moving to the cloud, that you start hearing all these new words, all these new acronyms. You start hearing about EC2 and S3 and KMS and all of these things, right? And it's a lot to take, and it's understandable that we initially would want to sort of lower complexity and sort of move everything the way we had it before. But as you learn more about it, you start thinking, well, okay, at first we were using EC2 to move our virtual servers. We were using S3 and EBS to create disk space. We started using the relational database service for the databases. But all of this is very much one-to-one. It's all like, this is what we were doing before, and this is what we're doing now, and it's all one-to-one. And so what you start realizing is that there are tools that can help you improve and optimize your systems if you think in a different way, right? So instead of using something like key management service, which is what you initially use to give people SSH access, like your developers and your sysadmins, to your system, you might start using something like Systems Manager, which is a more advanced way of providing this type of access. You might start using things like the Global Accelerator, so that rather than assigning specific IP addresses to your servers, you can provide one IP address to a service in general, and then redirect traffic from that IP address to any host, any number of servers that can live anywhere, right? So you start sort of like decentralizing your systems and make them more resilient and make them also more able to be flexible. So You might also start using things like application load balancers and auto scaling and that sort of thing. And that also gives you also ways to do things like infrastructure as code, right? So you start thinking of new strategies. That's what you really need to think about is what is a way to think about cloud-centric services that can help you provide services that use only what you need, right? And that's really the key here when you think about cloud formation, about cloud-centric strategies, is how can we stop buying servers that are only that are going to be bought only for peak times, right? So like the old way of doing things, whenever the new budget cycle will come up, we would say, okay, because the website gets at most hits during any period of time would be 1,000 hits, per minute. Then we are going to buy. That's just an example, but we would buy a server that can handle that type of traffic, even though that would only happen for maybe 30 minutes a day in the peak time traffic, right? So for the rest of the time, that server was sitting there spinning, doing nothing. What you really want to be able to do is do things like build smaller servers and then use something like use something like, sorry, I'm gonna bring it up to the next slide, to use auto scaling groups, which lets you build smaller servers and then you can spin up new ones whenever traffic becomes necessary, right? So there's all these different types of optimizations that you can start to do. The biggest one, going back to this slide, was being able to build our infrastructure as code, right? So before, we would do something where we would build servers as individual, sort of like, I want to call them beautiful flowers, right? Like you would start up a server, you would configure it manually, and now that thing lives in a way that cannot be rolled back or cannot be destroyed because it has all the history inside of it, sort of living as a configuration. The way we do things now is that we create CloudFormation templates that allows us to reuse components so that as we bring up new applications, we can, if we set, for an example, would be an Apache web server. If you need one Apache web server, you don't need to reinvent the wheel every single time. We can use our CloudFormation templates to roll a new one, and then as changes happen to that server, we can keep that as part of the code so that if you ever need to rebuild it again, we can destroy our entire infrastructure and rebuild it in another availability zone if we wanted to, or simply rebuild if we wanted to use another type of software, like if we, instead of using Apache, we wanted to use IIS or another type of web server. There's ways for us to now be able to be more flexible about the type of applications we use. So this is what we're thinking now, and this is where most of our services are going. We're making it much more easier to manage our services, because rather than each service being an individual thing that lives separately, we make it so that we reuse the systems and make it much more flexible and efficient for us to manage. So this is where what our new applications look like. You can see that we're thinking about using things like Lambda functions. Whenever we have things that, let's say you have a specific process that you want to run, and it only runs for a few minutes, let's say, once a year. For example, our ETDs, we receive those from ProQuest only 3 times a year, and we need some processes that need to be run at a specific time during those years. Rather than spin up a whole server, there are ways for us to now run applications on a serverless way, so that we don't have to pay for servers and think about configuration at lower layers. We just simply write code and run it in this cloud services. So that has made us a lot easier to manage, cheaper, better. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Jean for lessons learned.
And I know we're running a little late here. I'm going to try to rush through these things. Our lessons learned at an administrative level were how difficult it is to explain what cloud services is to people who are really thinking about technology as hardware, stuff they can see. And so first we had to start with library management and talk about things that we really didn't know that much about, but talk them into it. They were willing to take that risk. get campus approval. Campus had not had a relationship with a cloud vendor at that time. They just signed a relationship with AWS last year, and they have a relationship with Azure also. How to go through purchasing when you can't get a fixed price quote from multiple vendors to do some price comparison, and everything is sort of a la carte. That's also very, very challenging. And I say misconceptions about the cloud, but I really mean concerns about the cloud. Privacy and cost are the two things we hear the most about. We had to rethink how people work together, sysadmins and programmers. It's a very different way of working. And as Favenzio says, when you say that the service is the code, that's kind of interesting. And we had to rethink that. We had to make sure we had funds for training, because as we said, it's essential to being able to kind of shift the way you look at things. Next. I think we've talked about the strengths a lot. We do consider the last two. The services are now under our control, and we can respond to emergencies faster than we have in the past. And our emphasis is on the service and not the OS or the facilities. But there are definitely weaknesses, and I think this is some of the things that Cliff was talking about in our introduction. We're a vendor lock-in. We've been talking. Most of the things we say about AWS, you can get from other cloud services now, but every one of them is done differently. And so we are locked into this vendor at this moment. There's cost variability. The slide that Lewis showed can show how things can get out of hand. And luckily, by the end of the month that you've done something that's going to up your bill very quickly. We're highly customized to AWS, and it's very complicated. There's a suite of services that you can use, and how we mix and match those and use those is probably different at each institution. It's not right for all services. We're running virtual desktop servers that are on-prem right now because that's the best place for them. So we can't use those for the cloud. And there's a steep learning curve in doing this. Next. And so we have a lot of future dreams. We're going to take over our digital asset manager. It's a consortial manager right now, consortial service right now, and move that to the cloud, because this is an area of growth for our libraries. We are creating a data repository specific to one subject for learning disabilities data. We're going to reimagine our whole Born Digital library workflow. We're looking at open publishing, virtual research workstations, and managing the the life cycle of data and research. We know we need to develop an exit strategy, and that is one of the hardest things. And there's always more. There's always more things we want to do. Next. Okay, so we're the star there in Florida. If you can see the little red star, and that's a hurricane coming at us. We're not that concerned because our critical services are in the cloud. Sorry, but we're not in that cloud. That is a hurricane. So are there any questions that we can address? I'm sorry about the time.
No, not at all. Thanks. Thank you for making that distinction, Jean. And wow, that's really concerning. I'm glad you got your stuff in the cloud. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it, and it really is very thought-provoking. I see that we already have a question in the Q&A box, so let me just go straight to that, and that comes from Mary Beth Snap. Mary Beth says, very informative. We're along the same journey. I'm curious, how many team members do you have?
So we have currently really 3 developers and 2 sysadmins. Is that right, guys? And then these 2 managers that are, and that's on working on a huge variety of services.
Wow, fascinating. Okay. Thank you. Did anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so one thing that we've really had to do though with the staff that we have is the type of people who work in this environment. It's really hard to hire them, and honestly, we probably couldn't afford them as a library anyways. We've had to develop our own, and what we've done is we've taken developers and giving them some sysadmin skills, and then we've taken our sysadmins and giving them developer skills. Some are stronger in areas, some are stronger in other areas, but it was a way that we were able to get people to get this done in an effective way, and it's been very successful for us, I'll say.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Louis, that I think what you have to do when you deal with budgets like ours is that we hire potential rather than experience. We see people who we think we can train and that can learn, and then we hire them and sort of bring them up so that they can work with us in these new technologies.
And hope they stay with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary Beth, for that. And she comments spot on your assessment on staffing. So thank you for the question. Thank you for those responses. From Sarvani, he asks, for research lab virtualization, what apps have you considered? And thank you for the presentation.
So we've looked at a number of things, but Louis, do you want to talk about, the whole campus has been looking at how to manage data. And we've been keeping an eye on a project that's going on with Emory and others to create a whole management suite in AWS. I don't actually know what the apps are that they're thinking about. Louis, do you?
So yeah, we've been taking a look at this for about 2 years. It kind of started off with us being pulled into a big data research initiative to build some infrastructure for that on campus. And then we started taking a look at how we could support, being libraries, we're more interested in supporting all kinds of research data. And they're putting data into the cloud. I know what Emory's doing with their project is mainly a HIPAA compliant way to store and work with data in the cloud, where they set up an S3 storage bucket and a virtual server that the person can log into remotely and run queries on for different software such as R. We're taking a look at how we can do that as well, to try to do it up on a much smaller scale. We're just starting to spin that up though.
Okay, thank you. I see we have a few questions in chat that Louis has responded to. So let me just read those out to be sure everyone knows what those are. Let's see, how frequently do you back up the servers and data? What about the network infrastructure and costs to support these transfers? Can you please talk more about that? The reply is, we back up nightly. There's no cost to upload or move data within an availability zone. There's a small charge to move data between availability zones, such as Virginia to Ohio. We feel it's worth it. And he goes on to say, the big cost with data movement is out of the cloud, but there are ways to minimize that as well. And also, let's see, Martha Anderson asked, are there any other platforms or programs you're considering now for your exit strategy from AWS? The reply from Louis is, while we're not planning to leave AWS, we are looking at what it would take. There are other options. The other options would be Microsoft Azure or Google iCloud. And then we have a question from Cliff. Cliff asks, are you part of an institutional AWS contract, or are you on your own contract?
So we were the first official contracted at FSU with AWS. The institution just started last fall with a contract that they're writing from a University of Texas contract.
Wow.
We haven't joined that yet, and we've had some conversations with them. They're just starting off on AWS at the very beginning of their journey. They're trying to do disaster recovery there. They're really just getting started. So we're on our own right now.
Interesting.
I will say that we're looking at it mainly for simplification we've had, and for getting the bills paid on time, we've had some issues with purchasing, paying stuff on time, and getting things taken care of, since this is a new way of doing business. One of the things that we do that I personally like about the campus or the agreement at the campus level is being able to pass through costs. So if we have a researcher with a grant who wants to set up a something like LD base, or they want some research storage and a website, we can pass that cost down directly through to their billing without us having to handle the money or anything. It's all taken care of at the campus level.
Great, thank you. We have a question, another question from Mary Beth Snap. Have you experienced resistance or hesitation to having master digital objects, i.e. preservation, capital P, in the cloud versus locally?
We're really getting started on this process right now. We did, as Louis said, we took our highest level of preservation need, and we moved, those are our electronic theses and dissertations, and we moved those into Glacier. And we're now getting Archivematica set up, which is a tool to manage your preservation of your objects, and we're trying to understand what tools we're going to run. We're setting that up in AWS right now, and we're trying to figure out all the dependencies, because and it's our people managing the digital library and the digitization that are interested in doing this. So I don't think we have resistance, because we haven't figured out a reason not to do it. We will be doing checksums, etc. AWS has tools to do those, native tools. And then we're trying to figure out the best fit for all of this.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for that question. And thank you for those answers. A lot of great questions here today. Really appreciate everyone being here, and to our panelists as well. Any attendees who are still around to please stay with us if you would like to chat with Jean, Favenzio, or Louis. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, all you need to do is raise your hand and I will unmute you.